So this is day 20 of learning in SwiftUI for my coding journey. Now, before I get into the actual building of the app, I was first taught what the buttons are, how to change the color, and how to create alert controllers. But in this first image you see here, I'm learning the different ways you can create a button and how buttons interact and the differences between buttons in regular Swift and buttons in SwiftUI. So with the buttons in Swift, there's a certain interaction like an IB outlet and an IB action that kind of tracks the state in which the button is being pressed or selected or whatever you want to call it. But for here, we use the @state private var variables that works upon or that checks to see what happens when the user presses onto it. So with this, I'm kind of just creating more and more iterations of how a button can be interacted with. Now, the reason why some of them are highlighted red or blue or come up as selected is because SwiftUI or the buttons themselves have pre-designated properties that allow them to look this way. So these are just standard way of how iOS creates their buttons. So when it's red, that's basically destructive, and when it's blue, it's kind of like you're selecting the item, and the light gray kind of just indicates that it can be selected. So knowing the style in which iOS apps are created kind of helps you better create apps, so that way it's more custom to how users are normally, how they interact with apps. And if you notice here on line 38, there's something within the button called system image. Now, you know how Apple has their own types of icons, so all you gotta do is just look up the library and then just copy the name, and you're able to actually see what you can use for the app that you're building. And because there's a lot of inference going on in the background, depending on where you have the button, it'll kind of either use the name, the icon, or both, depending on the situation. That's how smart this language is. Now, when it comes to the colors, I think this might be one of my favorite parts of building an app. Putting the colors in, making it look certain ways, so that way it doesn't look flat, it looks more like an application. So here, I learned different ways you can add color to the views that is on the device itself, because I think almost every object has its own view beneath the surface. So when you are able to access the certain properties it contains, you can change it up and create different ways to add color to your app itself. So for example, linear gradient, radial gradient, angular gradient. I think my designer friends or designer community will know these type of ways you can add color to whatever you're working on. But the one that isn't commented out, that's the more simpler version of creating gradient on an application. I think that's the one I'm gonna be using the most with, just because the other three requires you to really understand the ways in which colors blend well, but how they're positioned based off a certain angle or contrast, right? It's a huge science when it comes to adding colors and making them blend in very well. So those three are kind of trial and error. And if you really understand how colors work, then you could really dive deeply into this and go crazy with it. Now, last but not least, learning how to create alert controllers. Now, alert controllers are what you see normally that prompts you to just take action on something, right? So I learned a little bit of that in regular Swift, but in SwiftUI, they kind of do things differently. It's like I said before in the beginning, where we use things called @state to test or see what happens when a person does an interaction with that said button. And since buttons have these embedded properties into them, we don't have to necessarily do much, but we have to add logic to, we have to add logic to the cancel and delete, so that way something can happen, because at this point it'll automatically close every time when we hit cancel or delete. Like there's no different action taken when pressing these buttons. Even though one says cancel, one says destructive. When things say destructive, it usually means you're doing an action that might cause something significant to happen. So like that's why when we delete our photos, it comes up as delete in red, because that's a significant action like that could end up losing your photos, or you just don't want it to have it. You don't want to have these images anymore on your device. So that's a big commitment or a big decision. Do you want to do this or not?